And welcome to this afternoon session hosted by the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Guyana. As regular attendees of our sessions know, we like to schedule these events to catch you as soon as you leave from your office and before you hit any social spots later on in the event. I'm happy to see so many of you here today. I suspect the very sexy title of our topic today may have drawn you to today's session. Mavericks, Subsidiary Managers. I don't want to suggest that we have a lot of Mavericks in the crowd, but I do recognize some senior managers among us. Today's session will examine, as the topic suggests, maverick behavior in overseas subsidiaries. It is a traditional view that if you're in an overseas subsidiary, that the natural expectation is that local managers will be following the instructions from head office. And to do otherwise would be viewed upon and frowned upon in a significant way. Today's presentation will seek to challenge that traditional view, and will seek to show that there may be actually a positive outcome from deviation or non-compliance at the local level. I think by the end of today's session, you will have an appreciation for the use of such terminology as constructive defiance and honorable non-compliance within the context of management structures. To take us through the presentation today, we have a member of the ICAG, I'm proud to say, a gentleman who has a very impressive background. Dr. Aaron Fraser is the CEO and Vice Chairman of Power Producers and Distributors Inc., which is a state entity mandated to operate and maintain power plants in the energy sector here in Guyana. Previous to that position, or those positions, he headed Wartsila, Guyana for just under 9 years, and also head the finance and accounting department of that entity for about 7 years. So overall, about 16 years in the entity. Aaron serves on the board of the GNNL, the newspaper, Guyana Newspapers, National Newspapers Bulletin, and previously on Guyana Forestry Commission. He is a Rotarian and has a passion for bettering the lives of others through the works that he undertakes. He also serves on the board of the YMCA and previously served on the executive body of several national sports organizations. For those of you, such as myself, who has known Aaron from school days, he was always a sports enthusiast. I wouldn't challenge him to say who's better, but I will give him that benefit as we take presentation. He is obviously, as I said, a member of the ICAG and the FCCA. He obtained his MBA from the Alliance Manchester Business School, and recently successfully defended his Ph.D. dissertation at the Weatherhead School of Management, associated with the Case Western Reserve University. I believe I know what I'm referring to as Dr. Foote. He did in fact say I can say Dr. Foote. Aaron's personal motto is, to aim is not enough, you must do. So with that introduction, let me allow Aaron up to the podium to take us through his presentation. Thank you, Khalil, for
those kind words of introduction. And indeed, it's a pleasure for me this afternoon to address or to carry this CPD session to such an august body of many top accountants, and I see a couple of head of subsidiaries. I'm not so quite sure if they are Mavericks or honorable Mavericks. However, you mentioned a couple of years of certain senior positions. I hope many people will start estimating my age. I'm still only 25 as a fast So this afternoon session will look at non-compliance in organizations. And specifically, as we go through them, you will see that traditionally non-compliance is viewed in an organization as something bad. Having served as the head of a subsidiary of Multinationals, there were many times that I didn't comply. But science will allow you to study yourself. It doesn't matter how good you are at introspection. So unless you find a sample body, study those traits, those characteristics, those trends, only then you can make claims in social sciences. And I think sciences as a whole. So when I started the program, I knew I had instances of non-compliance, and I thought it was a worthy course of study to undertake. I thought that there was something that I can contribute to knowledge, contribute to the practice of management. So to give my work some validity, I'll introduce you to the people who would have supervised my research. The first was Callie Newton, Finnish guy, 2 PhDs. 400 academic publication in peer-reviewed journals. You would have seen that I had 2 publications, but those sadly the academic world won't count because they weren't peer-reviewed. Though they were in journals that we expect in the week every month, like the Accounting and Business Journal that us accountants get, and the IB Business Journal. And you know, Western University in Canada is probably the Harvard equivalent. So Calais would also supervise over 130 destinations as chair, not incidentally. Then we had Dick Boland, over 200 academic articles that were published in peer-reviewed journals, many citations. And then the expert in my particular field of study, Becker Ritzpatz, a German professor, and finally Adrian Goldberg, who was an editor of an academic journal. So, to my mind, I had a very strong academic team who would guide the research process. It was, of course, at nascent. So, this afternoon session, I hope to achieve a couple of objectives. Identify factors which lead to compliance and non-compliance. To add balance, even if you're studying a particular phenomenon, you should also bear in mind that there are equally effective theories and models of what you study. So it's advisable that you also look at the flip side of that coin. Secondly, I would like to understand how those factors manifest. And then finally, I think more importantly to you here, is to advise you how you can harness those benefits of non-compliance, including when they trigger or instigate change management. So I'll go through a couple of examples of non-compliance that I speak about. In my interviews, I had a story that was told to me about the need for a cash holding facility. This is a firm in the security sector. I would imagine that holding cash safely is also, in a broad sense, part of the security sector. But here was this subsidiary manager being told by his head office that, we don't have a contract, so we should not start construction of this facility. The subsidiary manager was adamant because he was speaking with those bankers, and he knew that their request was genuine, and that eventually business would come his way. So despite not having that approval, he went ahead, he got financing, and he started that project. You imagine when he got a visit from head office, They were really angry, but they had gone so far that they could not have stopped the construction. To cut that story short, it was called back to head office. That project was completed, and today that facility holds cash for more than 90% of those banks in that particular regional territory. So that's one story I will share with you. The second was the need for an investment in CapEx. Again, a security company who recognized that having personal security, there was a need for better vehicles, new vehicles, because of course the maintenance costs for those vehicles were skyrocketing. There were many instances in that particular territory of kidnapping. So a lot of people were more conscious and they wanted that personal security. But yet again, head office would say this subsidiary manager, no, we don't approve of this, we don't think it's a worthwhile venture. Again, the subsidiary manager went out, we got financing, and he started that venture. He was called back to head office, because of course he didn't get any approval. And then the final example I'll share with you, it is a particular distribution company, large distribution company in the Caribbean and Latin America, with a subsidiary in Guyana, that has a particular return on investment benchmark that you must meet for all new initiatives. This subsidiary manager knew that given the numbers, he would not be able to meet the benchmark. But his reasoning was that if I can increase sales and add the profitability, good not meeting the benchmark, it's a worthy exercise. So he went along, he made the investment, started that business. At his quarterly review, his head office found out. He was recommended, he was asked to do a post hoc review of that venture, which eventually turned out that it was more than a benchmark. So in some regards, he was allowed to slide. But what that triggered was a review of how future investments in new business lines were done. So those are three examples, and as I go along in the presentation, you should bear those in mind, and I will draw various nuances out of those examples and the high abstraction of what we did and why we did. So in this study, the problem of practice is that subsidiary managers are not always aligned with instructions from head office. And when I say instructions, I mean that cadre of communication that is top-down, that includes things such as delegation of authority, procedures, policies, ways of working. So that's what I term instructions, just to capture that group of communication that is top-down. And managers are expected to follow these instructions, as I term them. They can be operational, they can be tactical, and strategic. But for this presentation this afternoon, I will focus more on the strategic aspect of non-compliance with these instructions. Because simply, I think, focusing on the strategic aspect, the consequences of not being compliant can be more damning to the fortunes of the company, as a subsidiary, and even to the company as a whole. So why should non-compliance matter to us? Research has shown that 50% of new initiatives fail in the first 5 years. So you're going to start a new venture, and in 5 years it's going to go belly up, it's going to go south, and you're going to lose all of the investment. So that's one of the reasons why you should study non-compliance. One of the second reasons is there's a lot of suboptimal decision making whenever non-compliance occurs, simply because you're not in sync with what head office sees. And inevitably, head office, as the owners, the main custodians of the company, invariably they think they know it best, and they're seeing the big picture, and what you see in the subsidiary is only a small part of the company as a whole. So the second issue is there's a lot of suboptimal decision making. The third is that it can lead to a wanton waste of resources. Financing in many territories can be a hard thing to get, and we don't want people to be non-compliant and waste resources. And finally, it can lead to tense work relationships. There have been situations where you don't comply with the instructions, and the head office, as one interview said to me, there was a lot of brimstone and fire because he wasn't compliant. So intense work relationships can be very anti-productive, and very undesirable situations. And finally, it can also lead to unapproved risk taking. So you go out there, you want to take an initiative, there's no, in the view of head office, no proper assessment of the risk, and you just be entrepreneurial. So when I started, I wanted to understand why subsidiary managers engage in clandestine non-compliance, given the associated personal risks. People can be fired, the worst of the disciplinary measures that they take. And then secondly, I want to expand to the literature in international business management, entrepreneurship, and even change management. And finally, I wanted to provide practitioners with information to increase the tools that we have in the toolbox. So the study context, I started originally in the Guyana scenario, and then I extended that later as I went in, continuing to my research program to the English-speaking Caribbean. And why the extension to the English-speaking Caribbean? Because I thought we share many commonalities. We're all part of the British Empire at one time. We all speak English. We all came from in many territories, a plantation life. So there are many characteristics that are common. The level of analysis was at the individual level. So I look at the ultimate head of subsidiaries. So whether you're called country manager, managing director, CEO, it was that person who had the overall responsibility of the subsidiary were my research participants. The second nuance of the study was that I particularly designed it to ensure that the subsidiary and headquarters, head office, I'm going to use those two words interchangeably, were located in different countries. Because as I searched the literature, there were studies that were done that we term multi-domestic, where you have the subsidiary and the head office that are located in the same country. And finally, I focused on for-profit companies. No doubt, in non-profits, there are instances of non-compliance. So in my mind, I organize a framework, and any consultant, if you can do a 2x2, you're not working so hard. So in my mind, when your response to instructions, you can either comply or not comply, and you can do it silently or you can voice. So you can have announced compliance where you have the instructions, and then you say to head office, I've received your instructions and I'm going to follow them. That's the most ideal head office would want. And then there's unannounced compliance, where you receive the instructions and you just follow them. So head office doesn't know, unless when they check, whether or not you follow them. And then there's announced non-compliance, which we term voice. So here you receive instructions and you said, no, I do not think this is right. Ultimately, there being the boss, you may follow them. But the fact is that you've announced that I may not follow. And the whole crux of my research focused on, to my mind, which was the most valuable piece of non-compliance, is when you non-comply and you did it silent. So head office is blindsided in many instances. They're surprised, they're taken aback. And as I went through the literature, there was little work that was done on unannounced compliance. It was very, very little. So to achieve my objectives, I designed a study that first was qualitative in nature. So I interviewed head of subsidiaries just to understand the nuances of the phenomenon and to build teams out of those interviews that I will use to test in subsequent qualitative research. And for that qualitative research, I used surveys. And it was primarily cross-sectional surveys taken at a point in time. So so my claims can only be correlational and not causation. There was no time series data in my database. And then finally, I did another qualitative test because having done the first qualitative having done the first quantitative research, the second quantitative research was used to address some gaps and some conflicting results that I saw in the first qualitative research and the first quantitative research. So they $50 or the $100 consultant word instead of the $5 ordinary practitioner's work is that my method of research was a sequential exploratory mixed method research. And why this was appropriate is because for nuances or phenomenons that you don't understand particularly well, it is better that you have multiple methods so that you can triangulate your findings. And it adds rigor to your research. So the findings I'll share with my first study. I simply asked subsidiary managers to share instances of compliance and non-compliance. So they told me stories, I asked them how they felt, I asked them to tell me more, and we went through interviews typically lasted for an hour. At the end of this exercise, I had 140 stories. I looked for patterns in the data, and I extrapolated those patterns to higher variables, and finally I ended up with a couple of keys. One of the main things that I found was that when there was shared meaning and shared understanding, meaning that the instruction that comes from head office, both the subsidiary managers and the people who were issuing the instructions, once they understood and had a common understanding of what that instruction was, then there was compliance. Added to that, so that was the high level theme. Added to that, in cases where there were meaningful consultation, there was compliance. And when I say meaningful consultation, I mean in the crafting of these instructions, from cradle to grave, the subsidiary manager was involved. And not only involved, the final instruction that came out, the subsidiary manager saw that his input was statement of count. So he felt part and parcel of the process. He's not just giving feedback, but seeing that his feedback is incorporated into those instructions. Once that was present, he complied. Positive personal relationships, and this is one I can really attest to. So when I started to work at Mozilla, there was a heavy focus on what we call employee morale. So we had many social events, both with the locals and when the expats came. Well, not expats, when we had visitors from overseas. And you understand that the camaraderie that is built engineer a sense of organization citizenship. You felt part of the group, you felt part of the team. So those seemingly informal encounters built a sense of trust. So positive personal relationships, as I termed them, aided compliance. On the other side, there was a lack of shared meaning. That's where there was some amount of information asymmetry. What head office saw and what the subsidiary manager was seeing was different. And you would imagine that the subsidiary manager, being acquainted with local conditions, the skills at his disposal, he would be in a more advantageous situation than those at the head office. But added to that, subsidiaries that were successful, the high flyers in the group, that fostered less oversight by head office. Head office started to manage by numbers. So once your numbers were fine, things like audits, and these are depending on what industry you are, but things like financial audits and technical audits were taken to the back burners. So subsidiary managers used their success to gain more autonomy, and they were able to be more clandestine in their management of those subsidiaries, and they were non-compliant. But the most salient of finding in that first research was that not only that they were non-compliant, but they were non-compliant in an honorable way. It was never a case of them wanting to defraud the company or to do anything illegal, maybe borders on unethical behavior. But it was always with a sense of doing something that was honorable. Their thinking essentially was, I'm in the local situation, I know it better than head office, and I'm going to disobey, I'm going to break the rules, but I'm doing it because my intentions are honorable. It took me a while to understand what this meant and to get the correct term. I later found out that this is what we call positive or constructive deviance, which, and I will read verbatim, I define to be a commitment of subsidiary economic resources to value-adding and value-seeking business activities without head office prior approval or knowledge. And the key to this is that the intentions are honorable and there's no personal benefit that is attached. So despite they being non-compliant, there was a positive spin to their non-compliance. Forget about the stars and the figures, and just pay attention to the boxes. So in my second study, I ventured to understand what are the factors that really influence independent subsidiary initiatives. An independent subsidiary initiative, in my mind, falls under the catalog of positive deviance. Some of the other things that are in that grouping includes things like extra role behaviors. So this is a case where, despite a particular function not being in the job description, you will voluntarily do it. It means things like taking actions to preserve skills in your company. I was given one, and I'll give you one example. So there's a particular timber company in this country that this country manager was asked to retrench some employees. And she knew that the retrenchment, once she had retrenched those employees, those skills were gone for good. And in her best estimation, the hardships that the company was going through at that time would have been just for a short period. So instead of following the instructions issued by head office, she said no. So she reorganized. Maybe I should not have said she, but but yes, she reorganized, and she was able to keep all those employees. Again, in her mind, she thought if she had lost those skills, the company would have been worse off when the fortunes of the company would have turned around. So that is another example of extra role behavior. And then there are things like citizenship behavior where you try to do everything that is possible to ensure better outcomes for the companies. So my model, my theory that I had in mind was simply that, and this came from the qualitative research, the findings of the qualitative research, I had in mind that past business performance, and I should say past successful business performance, will impact that positive deviant behavior of subsidiary initiatives. And then the level of headquarters control should also impact that. And I call it different in assessment, but the proper term should actually be information asymmetry, which I mentioned before. Thinking that once subsidiary manager in a better position at head office with regards to information, so there's an inherent asymmetry which benefits or is the advantage of the subsidiary manager. That should also influence his positive deviance. And then I thought there must be some amount of motivation to do this. And finally I thought there must be some amount of autonomy and independence to undertake such actions. When I looked at the literature, there were some things that showed up or were proven to be instigators of pro-social behavior or positive deviance. So things such as the scope of the company, the education of the subsidiary manager, and how long he spent in the job. You would, if you look at the model, you would recognize that some of these factors are individual level factors and some are structural factors. So the findings of the second study is that headquarters control directly impacted independent subsidiary initiative, and that was most significant. So in cases where headquarters control was, for want of a better word, I should say, very stringent, then there was less likelihood that independent subsidiary initiatives would have been undertaken. Information asymmetry directly impacted independent subsidiary initiatives. Again, once the subsidiary managers thought they had superior information than the head office, they would just go ahead and undertake these positive deviant behaviors, initiatives. But what I found was that despite being successful in the past, subsidiary managers also required autonomy. So it wasn't only being successful that engineered or drove independent subsidiary initiatives, is that they must have had the independence and the autonomy to carry out those actions. When autonomy was present, it also amplified the effect of headquarters control on the manifestation of independent subsidiary initiative. So while headquarters control alone will decide whether or not independent subsidiary initiative will occur, when autonomy is added to that, it has an amplifying effect. But surprisingly, I found that, and maybe it was the motivation construct or questions that I used, subsidiary managers were more likely to comply in the model. The third study, somewhat similar to the model of the second study, but in this study I added a cognitive factor, which is entrepreneurial self-efficacy. So self-efficacy as a whole will say you have the self-confidence to do something. But in this particular case, because of the examples I gave you, which had aspects of entrepreneurship in it, I used a particular construct of entrepreneurial self-efficacy, which is specific to the particular activity of entrepreneurship. So I use that as a mediator or a layman's term, a go-between the independent variables of motivation at work, successful past business performance, and information asymmetry. And because the literature says that you not only must have a motivation, but you must have the belief that you can do it. We had an interaction term which we thought would have impacted independent subsidiary initiative. Again, positive deviant behavior. To our surprise, that interaction term did not affect positive deviant behavior in any way. It was not significant. So I'll share some more findings with you. We found that businesses who were successful, it built on the entrepreneurial self-efficacy of managers. So they became, particularly they became masters of the situations that they were in, the business situations that they were in, so they became more confident in what they can do, and they were willing to explore and be non-compliant. We found that subsidiary managers who possess a high level of entrepreneurial self-efficacy were more likely to undertake independent subsidiary initiatives, or, as we say, be honorably non-compliant. Again, despite being successful in the past, you must have or must possess that cognitive belief that you can succeed before you can go against the grain and be non-compliant. And as we suspected, this cognitive factor of entrepreneurial self-efficacy amplified the effect of information asymmetry on the manifestation of this positive deviant behavior of independent subsidiary initiatives. Other findings that came from the research were managers with a master's degree or higher were 25% less likely to be non-compliant. And one of the things that stood out for me, while we gave qualifications, Greg is here, Greg and I, and someone else was having this discussion a couple of weeks ago. We put a big tag on qualifications. And the person we're having the conversation saying there's a vast difference between qualification and education. I can tell you that there are few companies, large companies in Guyana, that are successfully run by people who have a little more than CXCs and or O levels, and they've done many short management courses. So those are one of the things that I discovered in my research. So having a lot of qualification is no guarantee that you can run a successful business. It's something nice to have and get you through the work. Right, but we found that those with the masters above were maybe more sheepish than those who didn't have all the qualification. Maybe had a point to prove, so they would venture out and be more entrepreneurial. We found that subsidiary managers whose tenure as head of the subsidiary was less than 5 years was twice as likely to be non-compliant than those who were at the helm of the company for 5 years or more. Again, one explanation could be that being new into your position, you had a point to prove, you had results to deliver, so you're more likely to take chances and be non-compliant by undertaking entrepreneurial overtures. We found that size of the subsidiary didn't matter, and I measured size by the percentage of revenue of the subsidiary. The revenue of the subsidiary as a percentage of the group as a whole. So in my mind, if you had 20% of the group's total revenue, then you would consider a large subsidiary. But when we look at the statistics, size didn't matter. So whether you were small or big, subsidiary managers were going to not comply with instructions or not comply with instructions. And then we look at the scope of the subsidiaries, and we define scope as the level of or the amount of economic functions undertaken in the subsidiary. Some subsidiary, would have full scope; they'll do everything, and while others are in a situation where some functions are centralized. But again, scope didn't matter. Subsidiary managers still complied or didn't comply when they felt the need. So practical implications. You would think there's a need for a balance. Non-compliance can be bad, but non-compliance can also be good. So as managers, how do you manage that? How do you decide what level of leverage and autonomy to give to subsidiary manager? And I should tell you, these instances of non-compliance aren't only applicable to a head of a subsidiary and headquarters relationship. They also happen in local subsidiaries. So you have mid-level managers who will not comply. It can start as simple as not clocking in to not preparing monthly reports, not following, because of course certain practices, recommended practices. But how much leverage do we give them? How much autonomy, how much independence do we give them? It's always a hard question. Non-compliance is inevitable. So now I hope that I can leave you with a couple of tips, suggestions, so that you can handle non-compliance and harness the benefits of non-compliance. One of the most critical things to reduce non-compliance is controls. Whether these controls are electronic, they're physical, will determine the level of independence subsidiary managers have to undertake those clandestine activities. So you must invest in monitoring systems if you want to control non-compliance. For those who have worked in large enterprise management systems, that's one of the ways that you can use to control non-compliance, where approvals go through several chains. It's little paperwork, but there's lots of access rights and levels of approval. So that's one way of controlling non-compliance. Carrying out your audits is another way, which is not the ideal because you do it after the fact. But it's also a way of sending a signal to subsidiary managers or mid-level managers that we have eyes on you at some point in time. Your actions are not going to go unaccounted for. So audits, both technical, financial, and when I say technical, it is specific to your field. The second big overarching theme that you can use to reduce non-compliance is behavior, which is more people focused. So what we've seen is that there is a lot of non-native management. So many of these subsidiaries to control non-compliance, or even local subsidiaries when they send out to branches, they will send a manager from head office, in the hope that he goes there and he takes with him the values, the practices, and the expectations of head office. In the case of international companies, lots have expats, because again, they have them to be the main communicators of those practices and expectations at head office. So they want a transfer of that particular culture. And then I speak of culture, acculturation. So it's one way of saying to people that these are the things that are expected and we should operate in this particular culture. As I pointed out before, meaningful consultation must be part of the process and they see that your input is being incorporated into the process. Then you can reduce non-compliance. And finally, building personal relationships, which I've gone through before, they play an integral part in reducing non-compliance. You start speaking the same language, you start understanding things the same way, you become more trusting, so the likelihood of non-compliance is reduced. And then how do you foster positive deviance non-compliance? It's a mindset is intention trumps results and outcomes. So it must be communicated clearly that we understand that the outcomes will not always be ideal. But once our intentions are honorable, it's accepted that you can make missteps. And I repeat, so it's intentions should trump outcomes. We should not only be results focused. Results, of course, most of us are not running charities, profits come. But none of us could say beforehand whether or not the venture is going to be successful or not. Whether or not we don't want to pick on the bankers, but whether or not we issue a loan and the loan is going to repay that loan. Circumstances change. There are things that we can control and others that we can't.
So reviews should not be limited to results. To foster positive deviance, oftentimes one of the things that I also found was that people would not comply because the instructions are restrictive. They're not updated. They're not sufficient for the situation or circumstances that subsidiary managers face. So in that regard, they will just disregard, in that situation, they will just disregard the instructions because they feel restricted. So it is a good time, if you see positive deviance being exercised often, for you to review those instructions to make them more up to date. So that triggers change management. It should be communicated that mistaking is acceptable. Again, we would like to set benchmarks, but those benchmarks should be taking into account the local conditions. It should be clearly communicated. There should even be rewards for risk taking. So again, we don't focus on the results, but the fact that you're going to step out and undertake an entrepreneurial venture should be rewarded or recognized. Whether it's tangibly or just recognition in a non-tangible way, that should be done. And then entrepreneurship should be encouraged. And how do we encourage that? The most foolproof way to do that is to provide training, including coaching, mentoring, entrepreneurship, and the undertaking of entrepreneurial ventures is not, I think if we look at the group here, most of us are employed. Coming from a Guyanese situation, we always look to become the CEO of someone else's company. So with training, it will inculcate a mindset of positive deviance and entrepreneurship. So my research wasn't perfect, as you would expect. I'm a nascent researcher, and there are many opportunities which I can improve, and maybe once I would have done those improvements, I see the journey. Invite me to share those improvements in my research and so garner more funds from the Kitty for October. So the data I got was only gathered from the subsidiary managers. So it was them telling the story. I did not go back to, let's say, headquarters to triangulate or to verify what they were saying. Everyone is going to, we have a tendency to say, yes, I didn't comply, but it was successful. But that's in your interviews. It gathers more weight when headquarters would have said, yes, he didn't comply, and it was successful. Success in your mind and success in their mind is two different things. You might start a venture where your subsidiary is doing well and seeing a profit, but it might have cannibalized the group as a whole. So that's one area that I could have improved on the research, and my results were a lot more weighty. I did not focus on the effects of rewards. And most of us here have bonus schemes. And some are tied to sales, some are tied to profits. I came from that industry where I saw many people doing things, especially when it's coming to the end of the year, because you have targets. My research, I didn't address that. I didn't ask any questions or whether or not what would affect some bonus and the actions that you took. So that's another area that I can improve the research and share those results with you. I also didn't account for the culture of the organization, whether it was encouraged for you to be non-compliant. There are some companies that openly say you can be non-compliant once your intentions are out. They won't encourage you for fraud, theft, and anything illegal, but there's a culture of entrepreneurship. Once you see there's an opportunity, whether or not you're in a particular industry, you can venture out in that industry and just go ahead. In my models, I could have accounted for training. So I didn't account for training to see whether or not training contributed to it. While it is well documented, I cannot make that claim for the Guyanese scenario or the English-speaking Caribbean that training has shown. So I should also tell you that the response rate for my survey was pretty high, 30%, which in academic surveys is a pretty high response rate, especially the surveys. The typical response rate for surveys is between 4 and 6%. So that brings to the end of my presentation. I hope you would have learned at least one thing. And I can tell you, if you want to control, non-compliance. But if you want to avoid non-compliance, then control is 1%. So whether or not you make that investment in monitoring systems, or you do it post hoc by audits, it is controls that will determine whether or not you comply or not comply. So now we go to questions. Well, I take comments first before we batch into the questions. Or no, you can ask questions, seek clarification in English.
Where do you draw the line with a non-compliant manager who is otherwise successful?
How do I draw the line?
Where?
Where do we draw the line? Well, I can tell you it is strictly contextual. If I stand here and I give you an answer that is black and white, I'll be wrong. But if you hire me as a consultant, but on a serious note, it's strictly contextual, right? So if you're results oriented, then you can allow people to break rules. If you see breaking the rules, when you look at it post hoc, has valid claims, then you trust the rules. Because the rules should match as far as possible the business context which we operate.
So the end justify the means.
If that's a culture for our organization.
But
if you so that's if you're utilitarian. But if you're Kantian, it's the intentions which counts.
Well, it's financial objectives most of us are looking for.
Yes.
And I mean, in the case of Guyana here, you're dealing with a lot of times managers you're dealing with a pool that is not always qualified. So you have to work the way you have. And I think you're bound to take excessive risks and allow excessive non-compliance.
Well, as I said earlier, I will tell you that we don't run charities, we run business. So at the end of the day, your intentions could be honorable, but if your intentions are honorable and the results don't come over time, then you go belly up.
So I figure in the future probably do a study of that aspect, which to me is a more interesting subject.
Certainly it can extend the study of that and keeping research agenda.
Yeah, but what percentage of the responses were local companies as compared to maybe regional? And then to follow up to that, would you say the experiences for the local companies were similar to the region, or were they different?
So that was also an area that could have been improved. So I did not ask. It was done anonymously, so I couldn't say I could send it to 20 people here, but I didn't know who responded, and I didn't ask that particular question. I gave them that option to say which country. So that, and also industry. So it came from a wide cross section of industries. So I couldn't say, I wasn't in my sampling. I could have been a lot more strategic by saying I only want bankers, I only want distribution companies, those kind of things. That would have been a little more meaningful. But I'm confident that the fact that I had a high response rate, and a broad cross section of managers, then my claims are fine. They're passing. But of course, it will need more studies to really, before you can make generalized claims. This is just a start.
You say in your research that if accountants are most likely to be compliant than the engineers.
Right. So that is another. So right. So that is another thing that is another thing to look at industry specific. Or I didn't ask the subsidiary manager whether or not he was an engineer or an accountant. I just asked whether or not he had, a master's or above or a bachelor's and below. So we didn't look. But I would expect that the bankers might be more compliant. Generally. Generally. I mean, on a strategic level, maybe operationally or tactically, there may be some leverage. But bankers, because of the strict laws and policies and acts of government, I expect them to be more compliant. And as a matter, as a matter of fact, yes, we have one banker or two bankers, or a couple of bankers, but I'm not singling any one of them out. I'm not saying that any one of them participated in my research. But when I did the qualitative part of the research and we had these stories being told, indeed bankers were more compliant. We found people in the service industry were more likely to be non-compliant.
You probably didn't look at non-performance though, but my question is from the people who didn't comply and had failure, I did that come up, but what was the consequence?
So the thing is that we have a positive disposition. Many of us don't like to tell stories of failures. And I'll give you examples. You have interviews with people and you say, what are your strengths? And they tell you, so what are your weaknesses? Some know. So to get stories of guys saying, well, look, I failed. And mind you, I wanted stories that says, I didn't comply, but the end result was good. So there were seldom stories that were told to me that says, I didn't comply and I failed. So they all tell you good stories. So you don't get people to tell you, especially if they're in the job. And most of these people that I interviewed were in the position that they were in. So you don't expect them to even tell you the bad stories. So I would attempt to research fraud. I mean, Nigeria stand a better chance, especially if they're out of job.
When I'm talking about fraud, I'm talking about where they went out to get instruction and whatever they want to take was a failure.
Right, so those stories weren't really the focus of the research. I wanted to know where they didn't comply and they succeeded.
Did you have any instance where they did not comply, were successful, but were penalized?
Yes. And the first example that I gave you of the cash rolling facility. So today that's a success story. So the end result is, but I'm not even sure if that man can still come. But I know the initial reaction of the headquarters is to call him back to his home country, to bring him back to work in the office. So there are stories. And even the other example that I shared of the benchmark return on investment level. What they did was they changed the policy of the company. So once you contributed positively to the company, I can't remember what is the benchmark ROI, but it's 10%. Once there's a positive contribution, we're allowed to take that benchmark. Questions, comments, clarifications?
First of all, thank you for a very insightful presentation. One quick question. Did the study or did your research take into account supervisory committees or boards that would have been overseeing subsidiaries where managers were non-compliant, whether be it announced or unannounced?
Not in the quantitative. In the qualitative, those stories came. So some subsidiary managers say, you know what, I'm going to refer this to the board, and they said nothing, or they see my monthly reports and they say nothing. So I'll take it that if they say nothing, maybe there's my action, right? But and that's another area. So the culture of the company, where the board is concerned as the oversight body, that could have been another a variable that I could have taken in the quantitative part. But indeed, in the open discussion, the interviews, that did come up, where the board is silent, and even cases where the board said, no, we don't do it. Like in the case where the subsidiary manager is asked to retrench, that was something that came from the board, right? But she was not going to have that, because she knew that if she lose those skills, they were gone. So even when the company would have rebound, it might have been a worse situation than right then. So she found extra work productive.
Sorry, just one question. You mentioned where the new managers less than 5 years were non-compliant. It didn't matter whether they worked in a company before.
No, these were all new hires. So these were all new hires. No, but sorry, they were in that position. No, I can't say whether or not they were promoted. That is a particular nuance that I didn't see. So I didn't say whether or not they came through the ranks and you were promoted into the position, so you knew the culture of the company and you know, like. But the whole emphasis was that I was new in this position. I have a point to prove. I have to make my targets, and I'm going to make them as creatively as possible, even if it meant being clandestine.
But were they brought in with a mandate to change things?
No, they were actually brought in with a mandate to say, these are the rules that you should follow. These are the policies you should follow. These are the procedures that you need to follow. This is the way of working. This is the delegation target.
You did mention control as one of the elements of aiding compliance. I'm not sure if you're ready to say whether the level of control had any possible relationship with the level of compliance, non-compliance.
Right. So the higher the control, less the non-compliance. So it's an inverse relationship. The less the control, the more likely they will have freedom to do whatever they wish. While it is common sense to say, but of course you still have to prove that in your particular situation and research project that matters. Right? Because it's shocking to know that motivation played no part in it, which doesn't make sense.
But you actually were able to establish that in the quantitative.
Right. So I was telling somebody earlier today, so stats don't prove theories, they validate them. So because you can collect data, and this is what you can collect data, big body of data, and you run the correlations, and then you see significant relationships, and you build a story about them. Right. So, and that's not some rigorous social science, right? So that's why I should probably chosen more strategically in South population.
The research was on Mavericks subsidiary companies. The implication being here that they are somewhat remote from their head office. For those of us who are not in that situation, how transferable are the results of this study for let's say the branch situation where you're not at head office, but you're not as remote as would be the case of a subsidiary manager?
It's very transferable. As a matter of fact, there's lots of research that shows, so that's what they call a multiple state. So you're all in the same country, head office and the branches. Right. So branches subsidiary could be synonymous, right? It's just illegal. But there's lots of research that demonstrates that these things happen. That's why I didn't want to replicate that particular stuff and go particularly with where there's distance and geographic distance, different countries, different culture. So, but indeed, there is lots of research on multi-domestic non-compliance, right? And even non-compliance between the levels of the CEO and the next first-line managers or middle managers. There are lots of literature that speaks about that. Well, they're slightly different, but I thought in my research, I look at more the strategic, the more impactful activities could change the fortunes more than non-compliance in middle levels, managers. Because I thought, if you go entrepreneurial, decisions that are non-compliance at those levels can also have damage effects. But I think the magnitude of entrepreneurial activities could really transform the fortune of the company, whether for good or bad. And stats show 50% of initiatives, new initiatives, fail in the first 5 years.
Sir, I missed the first part of the presentation. What exactly was your definition of non-compliance?
So non-compliance is you have the instructions. So I call it, I say instructions are things that I call delegation of authority, policies, procedures, ways of working. I call all of them instructions. So this is something that is coming from head office. And you are aware of. Head office is, Greg, these are our instructions, policies. So you're aware of it. And then you say, okay, I'm aware of it, but here's a situation for me, I'm not going to follow it because I think it's this. So that's essentially, so it's a conscious effort. So it's not like you're unaware of this policy and you did something. You're aware of it and you still went against the wishes of the office. So that's not compliance.
This is a very fine line between being empowered and, some people, what people call non-compliance is actually not non-compliance. You actually need to make the decision.
So this is the quandary, the paradox we face as head of subsidiaries. Head office often say you need to be proactive, you need to be creative, you need to be imaginative, right? But you also need to follow the rules. You understand? So indeed, it's a fine line, right? So those catchwords are you need to be proactive. So here's a business opportunity. If I don't take it today, it's gone. Do I wait until head office is okay to do it, especially if you operate in different time zones, or do I just go ahead and say, after the fact, I'll get it? And then if it doesn't work out, then it's So yes, indeed, it's a fine line of whether or not you're being non-compliant or you're being proactive. But there's always a framework that you have to have.
But when you did the qualitative analysis, do you think across the different sectors they had different ideas of what non-compliance was?
So I didn't ask them specifically what is non-compliance. I asked them to say, tell me stories when you didn't follow the rules. Tell me stories when you did something that an office did. So I didn't really use those catchwords because I know it could mean different things to different people. But as you hear those stories, you can, what we call coding, thematic analysis. So you can look and you can read sentences and say, according to your interpretation, because qualitative is constructive. It's your interpretation of the language. But oftentimes you'll go back to some of the interviewees and say, what did you really mean when you said this? So those are the things. Or you ask them to tell me more. So they would have given an explanation. You said, oh, tell me more. So that they could really elucidate what they were trying to say. So we don't really use those categories because they could be loaded.
Just to support that, but there's this word clever. There's a thin line, right? A lot of times, so we have the rules established, but we will do things in accordance with the rules, but we're clever in getting it done. But that's not considered ethical or moral, right? So to me, it would be you're getting it done in all legal way, but at the end of the day, it's not ethical or it's not moral. It may be seen as non-compliant.
Indeed, it could be seen as non-compliance. But those are situations that you really need to give feedback. Again, I get from what you say, I get the impression that the rules, the policies are restrictive. And those are times that you really need to put up your hand and say, look, this rule needs to change because of X, Y, and Z. Head office doesn't want to hear this rule is restrictive on releasing business. I would imagine that.
Aaron, was the research slanted towards non-compliance relating to financial results? What about non-compliance where there is no financial? And would the interviewees, those that you study, likely not to comply when there is a financial measure attached to it, and otherwise just fall away the office?
So because I research businesses, there's always a financial implication. But there are cases where, though the financial implication was taken into account, it was more the safeguard of what I call a skill capacity. Whether I had a particular operator of a machinery who is, and that particular skill is scarce, so subsidiary managers went beyond the call of duty to ensure that they retain those particular skills. Software, some managers even went beyond. So head office would implement a new software, and they would have had old software, so they ran parallel systems. So they didn't even fully change over to the new system because they felt that this particular software was more valuable than the updated system that is being set. So while there will always be financial underlying consideration, some of the stories told focus more on the people, the human capacity that's available.
One more, Aaron, quickly. Do you know of any level of compliance in the oil industry? I'll let you do that later. I'll do homework.
Let's say thank you, and I hope you would have learned a couple of things. Research shows that you only remember 30% of the things you learned the day before. So if you can make it 31, I'll be happy. Thank you.